be a one-person committee taking place, and we'll put item number 4 on consent. Obviously not a consent that will be difficult to achieve with one person, but no controversy there, so we'll just note and file that. And we will begin our agenda with item number 1.
Item number 1 is a discussion item only. This is the item regarding the Ad Hoc Commission on Revenue Efficiency and Office of Finance to provide a verbal briefing relative to the status of the implementation of core recommendations for improvements in collections, billing, and revenues.
And if we could have our representatives from CORE, if they're begin by giving their report.
Good morning. I'm Ron Galperin, Chair of the Commission on Revenue Efficiency, and actually good afternoon, rather. And I'm here also with fellow Commissioner David Farrar.
And if you could walk us through where you think things are in terms of the report and its implementation, that would be wonderful.
Well, I would love to spend a lot of time discussing the implementation, but so far, at least as we see it, quite frankly, there hasn't been a great deal of implementation of this. October the 1st was the date that this report was issued, and it's now about 4.5 months. And it's my understanding that there are a number of things that are being done at the Office of Finance to respond to some of the previous requests by this committee. But we have 65 recommendations, and we've actually got a matrix on the back, which is our recommendations tracker. Just for your reference, it is Appendix 15. We're planning to issue in the very near future a report about what the progress of all of these recommendations are. And there are not a lot of boxes, I'm afraid, that we're going to be checking. There are also references to those that at least we determined were responsible for a variety of different recommendations, be they things that would fall under the purview of council or city attorney or mayor's office or office of finance, ITA, etc. Some of them, of course, are overlapping, and where that's the case, we make a note of that as well.
So which of these are you aware of steps having been taken?
Well, there are ongoing steps that are being taken in terms of the technological aspect of this and the rollout of the new FMS system. Although it should be noted that that in and of itself is not a panacea. That's going to help, but it's not going to happen overnight, and it's at first going to apply to only certain kinds of receivables and for summary reporting thereof. It is a process, and we are cognizant of that. There also is currently underway an amnesty and settlements program, which the Office of Finance, I'm sure, can talk to in greater detail. So we're pleased that that is happening. But there are a whole variety of other recommendations, and again, we are cognizant that these don't happen all overnight, but we're still awaiting for them to happen. I don't know whether it would be helpful to take a few moments we had done a brief presentation previously, generally, but just to kind of walk you and the committee and those present through the report itself, and how we bunched our variety of 65 recommendations, because we're aware that 65 is a little bit much to digest all at one time, but they do fall into a variety of different categories.
I think that would be great if you would do that.
Would be happy to. So if you've got a copy of it in front of you, and there are also some additional copies that have been brought by Mr. Deering, so any others who are present who would like a copy, hopefully we've got some that can be distributed. We went through if you look at, I'll start in the beginning, which I guess is a good place to start. There's an executive summary, of course, our table of contents, and then we move beyond that, and we look at what some of the numbers are, and we've all discussed what some of those are in terms of the amounts of receivables that are non-tax receivables that are past due, and a staggering amount of them that are 120 days past due, and 42.5% more than 2 years past due. Although, as we all know, a lot of those numbers at this point are phantom. They are not collectible, but it's a question of how do we move forward from this point on. If you turn to page 8, what we go through is a thorough analysis of all of the city department's non-tax receivables, as well as the tax receivables, and talk about how much money is at stake, because that's sort of the bottom line of how much everybody wants to know. When can we see this money, and how much of it are we going to see? Needless to say, for those severely delinquent receivables, we're not going to get a lot, but it's about changing the process. And our estimate, and it's a bit of a ballpark, was that we could see an additional 10 to 25 million annually in the next fiscal year and for the next several fiscal years. And that's just from the non-tax receivables. You add to that some of the others and move forward maybe 3-4 years into the future, and you can be talking about $100 million or more. Just to also address something that's not in this report that we've looked into most recently, that would be parking occupancy tax. We have found that to be a really ripe for doing some reforms to that. And we see that now as very much low-hanging fruit. And the estimates are that we may be shortchanged anywhere between 20 to 40 and perhaps even as much as $50 million a year. And there's a lot of money that you can get out of that.
Written suggestions on that?
Yeah, we are actually in the process of putting together our next phase of reporting, and that's going to focus on that parking occupancy tax. But what we're also doing is, as we are finishing that draft, we're going to distribute it to the various parties that have something to do with it and kind of get their feedback on it and make sure that whatever recommendations we make are most feasible and viable. Turning to page 12 of this, we go through the best practices. We looked at cities like Dallas, Houston, Chicago, San Francisco. And then we also, to jump ahead to page 16, we looked at the various parties who have some role when it comes to collections. The Office of Finance, the mayor, the controller, city attorney, the roles that the CAO, the treasurer play, etc. What we continuously find to be a problem is with whom does the buck stop? And it's much too easy for everybody to point fingers at everybody else and to not take responsibility for not just collections, but it's what happens before collections. It's about thinking creatively about generating revenue. It's about billing. It's about doing all the things that you need to do so that it doesn't end up in collections. We, of course, go through the Messiah study as well, and that's on page 20, and also the FMS system. And there's still, I think, some, at least in my feeling, as much as I've delved into this, a little bit lack of clarity about exactly what we're going to get out of it and exactly what is needed to make it as useful as I believe that it can be. So we begin our recommendations around those issues in terms of follow-ups to the Messiah study, which is our first recommendation. And we really want to see something more akin to a centralized payment portal, which we think can make a big difference for the city, and a customer ID system that's going to be citywide, so that there would be an actual ID number that is attached to anybody who does business in one way or the other with the city. Again, we know that doesn't happen tomorrow, but that's where we ought to be working toward. Turning to page 24, this is about more clear and centralized authority. And what we found, and we've discussed this previously, was that finance has often found itself, and they can of course comment on this more in depth, have found themselves to often be asking departments to please comply, to please do X, Y, or Z, and you wonder where the teeth is. And so it's vital, as we see it, for finance's instructions to be treated as mayoral directives, and quite frankly, for the mayoral directives that have been issued previously, including Executive Directive Number 5, which had 7 very specific things that were supposed to be done by departments, and which we found to, in fact, not be followed through on, that there be consequences for that to happen. Number 7 is about adequate staffing for the Office of Finance. We know that furloughs, retirements have taken a toll on all of the city, but we have to look, at least as our commission sees it, very carefully at what are those positions that actually generate revenue for the city. Office of Finance positions when it comes to collections are, I think, at the top of that list. And we need those people to be spending as much time as possible collecting. There's also a revenue collection review task force, that's number 8. I had personally attended one of those meetings, and there was a motion that was put forward by Councilmember Parks also related to that task force and strengthening it, and perhaps Office of Finance can give us an update on what is happening with that, as well as with the Revenue Management Committee. To turn to page 28 and stop me if you have any specific questions about any of this, but I'm just going to try to run through this very, very quickly. In terms of quarterly reports of departments' compliance, and we believe that this is absolutely vital, because if you don't inspect, you can't expect anything. And it's about compliance of those departments with the collection guidelines, their performance, the progress they're making at cultivating new revenues, and we also believe that it's vital to track the recommendations that CORE has made and that have been made previously by the controller in audits of collections. We have in one of our appendices a cross-reference of the recommendations of the controller and our own, so that we can show how they dovetail each other. But if nobody is following up on a regular basis, then it falls through the cracks, and that unfortunately is what we see with a lot of things, and we're seeing it here. We want to see department managers attest to their compliance to all of the collections guidelines. That's number 12, which is on page 29, and to have very specific performance guidelines for those general managers. We looked at how do you give departments some skin in the game, because we believe this is an important part of the equation as well. We've looked at the LA County budgeting paradigm, which we think that there's a lot to be learned from, and to borrow from that to create a pilot program, as it were, where departments on some level can benefit from their performance when it comes to collections. We're cognizant that you don't want to do that at the expense of undermining the general fund, and you don't want to tie up money into an umpteen number of little pocketbooks, but that would be very helpful. And of course, employee recognition, because there are a lot of great things that city workers are doing, and there are a lot of great ideas that we keep getting from them, and it helps to say thank you, at the very least, every now and then. Inspector General, which we've talked about before, and we can get into a little bit further, and perhaps Commissioner Farrar wants to talk about that, and we'll come back to that in a moment. Changing the process flow and timetable. Again, we looked at the current timetable that exists, and I'll refer you to appendix number 4, and that is the flow chart of how it exists right now, which we believe has a lot of shortcomings, and so we actually created a brand new flow chart to show how we would like to change that.
What page is that on this?
That is on page, bear with me here a moment. The current flow chart is on page 72 as appendix 4, and the proposed flow chart is appendix 5, which is in the following page, which is number 73. I think you're looking at a copy that's actually black and white copy, so you're at a little bit of a disadvantage because we color-coded it, but there is a color-coded version of it which will hopefully make it a little bit clearer. Collection agencies, which we've talked tremendously about. There have been a lot of discussion about this in the council as well. It's finally beginning to happen that some things are going to secondary collections, although a little bit too slow for our taste. And we have to also remember that secondary collections are much tougher than primary ones, and that you've got to really provide an enhanced incentive for those collection companies. Because if they get paid the same kind of percentage or the same numbers as in the primary collections, you're not going to get a great deal of performance out of them. And so we go through selection criteria and all the various specific kind of contract provisions, in fact, that we would like to see in collection agency contracts in order to really make sure that they are as effective for the city as possible. Everything from performance guarantees and performance bonds, various benchmarks, preferences for local employment, incentives to aggressively work the back end of accounts, et cetera, and that's on page 38. Sale of debt, we've been talking about this for a very long time. There's a lot of very aging receivables that continue to be on our books. They sit there for a long time until finally they go to Board of Review to be written off. Many of the real old accounts aren't worth all that much, we know, but let's get rid of them, let's get them off of our books, and set up a process by which we can be selling off these aging receivables.
So have we moved at all in that direction in terms of setting up a process?
Well, very interesting. There was an experiment that was done with this about 2 years ago, which was not the most successful one, but it was also a very small little experiment in terms of dollars. We've been asking as a commission repeatedly that there be a process put in place for this immediately. We talked, for example, to a broker who specializes in these things who flew out from Philadelphia to speak with us as a commission. And there has been a lot of debate back and forth with Office of Finance and the city attorney, and they can speak to this, I think, more specifically about, well, does one have to have an RFP or an RFQ for the evaluation, and does one pair the evaluation of it with actually putting out an RFP, RFQ for the sale or auction of these receivables itself? And so here we are 9 months later, and we're still talking about it.
Are other cities doing this? Do we have models to...
This is pretty cutting edge, but other cities are doing it in small amounts, but with very specific kinds of receivables. For example, parking tickets are often a good pool that they can kind of have a predictor of how much they're going to get once they work those accounts, so that makes it a little bit easier to sell.
So are they doing complicated RFP processes, or are they just doing this in a more simple fashion?
My guess is that most cities do it in a more simple fashion than we do in the city of LA. Standardizing interest and penalties, of course, again, we've talked about this forever. We'd like to see something akin to an omnibus ordinance that will address all of that. And perhaps Office of Finance can talk about where we are with that. We go into liens and a variety of different kinds of liens that can be applied, be they administrative liens or things which are recorded, particularly relating to the parking lots, and we'll have more on that later on. Role of city attorney, and how we can get more attorneys working on collections, because that's absolutely vital. They've got a big backlog of these. They actually even testified at our commission recently that when it comes to parking lot operators, they've got 700, staggering, that they've identified as being a problem. That's an awful lot. 700 out of 1,800.
700 problem parking lot operators?
Well, not necessarily 700 operators, but 700 locations, because many of these locations have the same operator.
And I think you have one of your colleagues on the commission has joined us. Ms. Prezi, do you want to come up as well?
And then we'll try to get through this very quickly. Revising the accounts receivable and reporting template. This we felt was very, very important and has to be done immediately, because the numbers are deceptive in many ways. First of all, We have a report of that which goes up to 120 days, but then the next report is for that which is 2 years old. And there's a big difference between 120 days, or that which is 121 days, and that which is 2 years old. And we really need to do that with much greater precision. There are also numbers on there that reflect amounts that are not legally collectible for a variety of reasons. In the case of fire department and EMS, there are amounts there that are not legally collectible because we've gotten a certain amount of money from Medicare or Medi-Cal and can't go after an individual for the difference, and yet it shows up as a receivable.
Presumably, those should go off the books
Those should
right
be off
away
the
after
books
they're paid
immediately.
by Medicare.
In the case of DOT, there are amounts that even if we do collect, we owe a certain amount of that to other entities. And so it's a deceptive number if you do not have another column to indicate that. And we've got to stop talking about that which is phantom so that we can, in fact, focus on that which is real. Turning the page.
It also makes
yeah.
us look like we're screwing up more than we really are because there's a lot of dollars on the list that we haven't collected that is by definition uncollectible.
That is absolutely correct. Although there are other ways in which we're screwing up that are not in fact reflected in the numbers, but yes.
Right.
Not to say that it's a wash by any means. We really feel there has to be also an inventory of the databases that we have in the city as well as non-city databases because there are just multiple opportunities to kind of take data and to share those. There's no reason in the world why you should be able to get city contracts if you are well past due on other kinds of debts to the city. There are also non-city databases of businesses, for example, that we can be cross-referencing to make sure that we capture everybody. We have a lot of that information, and we really believe it's got to be shared. There was a good start with the posting of top debtors on the internet, but we make some proposals for how to broaden that. Making it easier to...
How many debtors do we post? Is it the top 100 currently?
Office of Finance, I think, could answer that better because it's there have been different numbers that have been posted over the course of the last year, so I'd like to know what I haven't checked what the current number is that are posted. We've got to, of course, make it easier to pay and more. I had talked for quite a while about what it is that I went through just to license my dog because I wanted to be in compliance and the hoops that I had to jump through and how much time and work was spent just doing that. And unfortunately, not a lot of people are going to do that if they have to jump through many hoops. Fire department begins on page 52, and what we're really interested in is, as we know, there are two outsourced contracts that were authorized by the council several months ago, one for EMS data collection, one for billing. And among the things that are contained in that contract is one provision, for example, of I believe it was $455,000 for expedited delivery of that. And in fact, the council in its budget for the coming year is depending on those numbers, but don't know what the status of that is. Either it's being expedited, which is wonderful, or it's not, and then should we be paying that $455,000?
And I believe we've heard elsewhere that we're pretty far behind on those numbers.
That is what I have heard as well, yes. DOT, which is the other big chunk of money, and I saw that there's representatives from DOT here as well. There's been a continuing issue of recalling severely aged delinquent accounts from ACS. Moreover, that ACS contract comes to an end in March, and this committee may want to query about where that is right now, because it was supposed to go out for an RFQ, and don't know what the status of that is. And in looking at the collection contracts, we believe that there's some great opportunities in redoing them to have provisions in there that really benefit the city, and we kind of go into the details on that, and I know Commissioner Parisi has been very, very interested in that as well. We looked at rental cars and what can be done about that. because right now the current law is that the rental car company within 30 days can tell us who the renter was, and then they're off the hook. But there's some things that we might be able to do about that, because if that renter is out of the country, good luck collecting that ticket. And about things that can be done in terms of...
I think it's pretty obvious, anything that we're stuck with in terms of trying to collect from the person that rented the vehicle is almost impossible. So we have to find some other process if we're looking at some revenue from that.
Absolutely correct. And one of the things that was identified actually by our Vice Chair, Cindy Misikowski, was that here are the rental cars that would like the city to build a central rental car facility at LAX. What can we do to leverage that desire on their part in a way that actually helps us collect a little bit more? A little here, a little there, and you're talking about real money. Housing Department actually is page 62, and there's actually an audit that's been conducted by the controller around this as well. We had some serious questions about collections there, and we won't go into it in depth, but that is pretty much the summary. Lots of appendices that back up these as well. We looked at all the various council files that have been introduced around this, and there have been too many council files that haven't been still brought together, which is an important thing to do. And our next phase, which we've been diving right into, is looking at intergovernmental transfers. And Commissioner Farrar can talk about that more at length. That would be monies that we get in terms of sales tax, other kinds of tax revenues from other entities, court fees and fines, documentary transfer tax, my favorite subject. Also looking at what opportunities there are to kind of engender a more entrepreneurial spirit among city departments. We're taking a very, very close look at sanitation, which has I have to say, some very impressive paradigms that we think can be applied to the rest of the city. Parking Occupancy Tax, which we've talked about. And the number one thing is to just get this thing moving. And there's, of course, the IG matter, which has been discussed previously, and would like to see that move as well. But it's just all got to move. It's been 4.5 months.
Well, thank you for the overview. Anything either of you would like to add? I'll start with David.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd just like to add a couple of observations, and I'm often the grumpy old guy, and sometimes I try to be the Pollyanna as well, sometimes in the same sentence. But I just would like to say that I think we've made some progress, but not as much as any of us would have liked. I think I just give a personal incident that happened to me like within the last month, and I mentioned it to the Department of Finance. My son got in the mail a letter from a company called NCO, which is one of the secondary collection vendors. And I thought, well, why is my son getting this letter from NCO? And when he opened it, it was a bill for EMS services, which he and I had both long forgotten, for about 5 years ago. We had never gotten a bill previously for that. But I thought, at least, whatever else has happened, all of our pounding on the table about turning over these accounts that are long delinquent to some new people so they can try to collect it is actually working by my personal experience of opening an envelope. I had just such a warm, fuzzy feeling about that. And we wanted to write the check right away because we were so happy.
So did you write the check?
Yes. And I think in the same line, so obviously...
Of course, the fact that they're 5 years old is not engendering of a warm... Something's happening.
Oh, I ran around the house waving the letter saying, this is because of my commission. So, see? And my son, he wasn't as impressed as I would have liked. Anyway, and I think I would want to say I think that the Finance Department has been very successful, at least with respect to the Fire Department, in moving forward to get those long overdue, not ever collected and perhaps not ever billed receivables, and giving them out to the staple of collectors that you already have contracts with to do secondary collections. I think they deserve to be complimented, because we've been saying secondary collections after everybody else gives up is a way to get a little more money. And I think the other thing is, and I'm sad to hear now that the EMS contracts are not moving forward as aggressively as they should have been, and I can't comment on that, but I still believe it was the right thing to do. I think it will result ultimately in a lot more revenue to the city. Now, moving right along, my observations go back to the middle of last summer when I went through all of the spreadsheets about where do we get the most bang for our buck from a point of view of a cost-benefit analysis. Where are the largest amounts of delinquent accounts receivables in the city? And there were two different departments. The EMS services, there was outstanding, carried as delinquent, perhaps collectible, perhaps not, $180 million, and the accrual rate was about $90 million a year. Now, I think based on that fact, and the Macias report and the controller's report and our commission recommended that something be done. Something has been done, and hopefully this year will show a change, hopefully a positive change. The other huge account of a delinquent account receivable, there were two of these, $180 million for the ambulance services, but $280 million for delinquent uncollected parking tickets. And it's accruing at approximately $140 million a year, or about $12 million a month. And at that time, back in the spring, we talked to the Department of Transportation, we talked to the Department of Finance, we had even some people come in from ACS, and they said they were taking steps to transfer that huge backlog of $280 million to these secondary collectors for collection, whoever they are. And I guess some problem was, as Mr. Galpern has testified, is that when you go after old accounts that have already been worked over by another collector, it's harder work. It costs more, and we even recommended that these contracts be amended to provide for an enhanced collections fee for old accounts like this. We also recommended that since the ACS contract provided that they're supposed to get $21, I think that's the number, for every one that's collected, that they get that money even if the money is collected by the secondary collector. We weren't wanting to go in and take food off of anybody's plate. And I think that has come up at least once or twice, well, once every 2 months since we've had this commission, and there's always some really good reason that isn't done yet. It's a really good one. They change, but they're all really good. And the last one, actually one time we said, well, don't worry about it because the contract expires in March. And we're going to be getting out an RFP, and so the bygones are bygones, the future's the future, and let's focus on the future. Now, I hope somebody behind me here from either DOT or the Department of Finance will come up and say, yes, we've already transferred those accounts to secondary collectors, and money's just piling up. I doubt that's going to happen, but I hope so. But if it's all going to rely on the new contract, because the old contract didn't give us the right to sign these to secondary collectors, then I hope somebody will come up and say, the RFP's already out, and 2 or 3 vendors are going to want to collect this and compete with each other. Now, I'm hoping. I don't know whether that's true. Now, let me just say one more thing, and this goes to the council, our relationship to the council, our relationship to the mayor, the whole thing. These are heartfelt comments, and I think I looked over the chronology of this. In 2005, the mayor issued Executive Order 5, which was ignored. In 2007, Laura Chick, as controller, issued an audit saying this should be done, which was ignored. In June of 2007, the city controller, the Office of Finance put out these citywide guidelines for collections. And I must say, I'm in the business of collections. I think the citywide guidelines that were put out by the Office of Finance are extraordinarily good. I haven't got any criticism. I think they're really good. It's called Citywide Guidelines to Maximum Revenue Collection. And they would have been effective if anybody had actually complied with them in any way. Nobody did. July 2010, Wendy Gruhl, the current controller, comes out with another report. And she references, and I quoted from her before this committee, but she's so right on with this, and her words are so eloquent that I'd like to do that again. She said in 2007, the Controller's Office conducted an audit, which found that everything is outdated, and so they did a follow-up audit in July. It says, it appears that the city remains stuck in the mud. She talks about the EMS billing thing, and she says the fact that they haven't done anything on that is outrageous and unacceptable. Thank God they have done something on it now. You guys did something, they did something, and maybe that will change. But the reality is, the Macias report came out in 2009, very clear what to do. Wendy Gruhl's came out very clear. Our core report came out in October of last year. And as I think was said earlier, there are 65 recommendations. It seems like a lot, but the goal was to make them specific enough that they would be easy to implement without something so general as you should do better. They were specific recommendations. I suspect that out of the 65 recommendations, probably only 8 are in any way controversial, or that anybody in this room or anybody and any of your other colleagues on the council would ever disagree on them. Now, where are we now? We have a report which we worked really hard on, and I just have to say the lion's share of the credit goes to our chairman, Ron Galpern, who's worked very, very hard on this. But I was going to say, I think we've had the best group of commissioners dedicated to doing something for the good of the city. That of any, I've been on a lot of commissions at the city and the county and all, and chairman of the CRA. I've never worked with a group of people who were so committed to helping the city get itself out of this mess. It's a great group of people. But right now, we have a report to the council. Now, I get the feeling when we come up and say, like we're sitting up there where you are, and we're talking to the people down here and say, how you're doing, they don't ever say that you're just an ad hoc commissioner and we don't have to do what you do. But I get the feeling that not having done anything the mayor said, the former controller said, the municipal, I get the feeling that without some authority and somebody somewhere saying, hey, okay, it's time to get serious about this, that our report will just be on the stack of all of these previous reports I've published. I really do believe that. Now, how do we get out of this hole? I believe that in order for our report to have any influence at all on any outcomes, council has to adopt it and say, we recommend that you implement it. I mean, they don't recommend it, and we direct. It has to be a mandate. And maybe if you can say, well, in those particular things, and maybe these 8 I'm talking about, if you have a good reason that you can't comply, tell us about it. Shifting the burden of not going forward, the burden of not going forward to the department or individual who chooses not to go forward and perhaps has a good reason. But right now, it's just one more report. It has no more validity than the Macias report. It doesn't add in any kind of authoritative way to the 2 controllers' reports. Somebody has to say, this is important to the city, and you need to do something. And I encourage you, when you report this out to council, to pick these recommendations. Maybe if you think there's 8 that there's going to be any grumpiness about, take them out and say, implement the 65 except for these 8 that cause everybody heartburn. But something has to happen. We're stuck in the mud still, just like we were in July. Thank you.
And I'm not sure I've even identified 8 that I disagree with.
They're not, when we were doing this, we asked people, review this before we publish it. Get back to us with your comments. If you don't like something in here, we'll sit down and work it out so that we say it in a way that you believe in it too. But I think right now, I guess what you've heard me saying for the last 10 minutes anyway, the ball's in your court.
Thank you. Cheryl, would you like to?
Let me just add, I mean, again, to echo what my fellow commissioners have said, I mean, virtually everyone in the city who's repeatedly looked at this issue has come up with the same conclusions, the same good directives. What's missing here is really a passion to move collections, to move the effective operation of collections throughout the city of Los Angeles. And that's why when our commission looked at and reviewed all of the different studies, all the different audits that had been conducted by the Controller's Office, the Mayor's Executive Directive, et cetera, the rules and regulations are in place, but no one has been driving compliance. And that becomes even more pronounced in the light of our current financial situation. I mean, we all saw the CAO's report yesterday to the Budget and Finance Committee, and sort of the bottom line of that report was that we are doing all right. Actually, the economy is beginning to evidence an uptick in terms of the collection of economic or revenue-based taxes. I mean, where we're falling down is once again on our collections and our inability to collect, whether that be in the ambulance billing area, whether that be in the parking ticket area. And so this effort is fundamental if we are serious about addressing the deficit that's projected for next year. It needs to move quickly. This is February 15th. If we can implement these recommendations quickly, we believe strongly that there needs to be a person, an inspector general, who will drive compliance, because that seems to be the element that has been missing. Reports are issued, and those reports sit on shelves somewhere without being given effect. And so there needs to be, and that I think is the most fundamentally important recommendation from our commission, is that an inspector general position be created, and that person will drive compliance. It's essential if we're going to be able to realize the dollars that are essentially available to us with effective collections. The second piece is that I would ask this committee to give special oversight to is the area of contracting. We've noted big revenue piece is the parking ticket collection piece. That contract is open. I would ask that this committee provide significant oversight and review of the elements of that contract so that the city is assured that we are achieving the best outcomes as it relates to the contract. Our commission gave a lot of review to some of the elements in the existing contract. I mean, those have been talked about. All of that needs to be tightened up. I would advocate that we look for some opportunities to insource some of that work. City workers who are impacted by the results of revenue collection have skin in the game. I think that they're the most effective agents of being able to secure compliance. But it's really critical that this committee provide the necessary oversight so that as we move forward in these areas, we're assured that the city is getting the best deal and the best opportunities to collect maximum revenue.
Thank you. And you all have been following the process towards establishing an inspector general. Where do you think that process stands now, or it doesn't stand now?
Could I not answer your question but say something anyway?
Sure.
Thank you.
As long as it's related.
I have no idea where it stands, but I do know that in an area of a time of tight budgets, there's probably a lot of pushback on adding somebody else. That will cost something. But given this long soliloquy of how this happened, this said to do this happened, this said to do this, and nothing has happened, I am passionate in advocating for an inspector general. I couldn't agree more with Ms. Parisi. I think that everybody else that's involved in this system already has a pretty full inbox, and this issue is not getting much attention in all those full inboxes. And I think if for a couple of years somebody had this specific task as part of their performance review, as part of their job, then the system and the culture within the city could change. But without that, without the Inspector General, I don't see how you're going to get the culture. And it's not just the head of the Office of Finance or even the DOT or whatever. It's a citywide culture that this is something that's not all that interesting. I mean, I've never told my mother that I work in a collections business. It's just not the thing you go out and want to do. But somebody has to do it, and I don't see that there will be any focus on it without an Inspector General. And I didn't answer your question, but I feel passionately that we need it.
Yeah, and I appreciate those comments. Either of you have a better idea of where things actually stand on this particular issue?
Well, it hasn't happened. I mean, part of the reason we are here before you advocating is that we think that we would like your leadership and the council really moving forward and giving effect to this recommendation. Again, we feel so strongly that without it, this will simply be another in a series of reports that have analyzed the city's poor performance as it relates to collections. And so, we think that there's urgency to this. We think the sooner the better. And we would ask that you bring forward this report to the full council. And number one on that list of recommendations would be the creation of the Inspector General position.
Yeah, I think we've, in the past, given pretty clear direction that we want this to move forward quickly, and we'll continue to push on that. I know Councilmember Parks and I don't agree on every issue by a long shot. That's certainly one that we have both expressed a desire repeatedly to move quickly on. And I can assure you that both of us are committed to not allow this to sit on a shelf, especially in this economy where we have to find every solution to even be a piece of the solution. We know there are other things we're going to do that will cause a certain amount of harm. But every $10 or $20 million we save are X number of services we save and X number of jobs we save, and it's all a win-win. So we've got to get this all done. Hopefully as many of these things as we can in the next few months, so we can actually benefit from the savings with these efficiencies next year.
Okay. Let me just say, part of our frustration has been every time we advocate, particularly for this position, there are all sorts of barriers put up and all sorts of reasons why it can't happen. And again, we just can't afford to not let this happen. There's
What
got
types
to.
of things are you hearing? Because we're not really being kept up on that dialogue.
Well, I think there have been some poor ideas about how it would be created. The use of consultants rather than kind of a person driving it. Where debates as to where the position should be located. I think we need to move forward and really demand that it happen, that it be located in a place where it can require managerial accountability. General managers of every department that has any piece of collections need to be held accountable for the success or the compliance of their operations with these standards. And the only way to do that is to make certain that we have someone located in, I would suggest the mayor's office, but we can, so that folks, departments are held accountable to these standards, that we are moving compliance with these recommendations, and that we've ultimately will become effective in the collections area. That's our sense of it. So we need to kind of work through whatever administrative bureaucratic barriers are getting set up and really insist that this happen and that it happen quickly.
Anything else you'd like to say?
Yeah, I'd like to
include the
in
update?
addition to the eloquent points that are made by my fellow commissioners, and I have to say that it's just such an honor and a pleasure to work with the most incredible group of commissioners who have just dedicated great time and expertise and continue to do so, and to meet with great frequency and to do a lot of work outside of the commission, and very, very grateful to be able to work with each of them. As far as the IG is concerned, that position at its very best has tremendous opportunity to do more than just, although obviously it's vital that it be about compliance, but it's also about how does the city find more creative ways to generate revenue and to think more clearly about the processes that it has set up. A perfect example is everything that we've discovered relating to the parking occupancy tax. What we did was we brought together the representatives of the Office of Finance and the City Attorney's Office and the Police Commission to all be at the same table and talk to us about the same subject at the same time. And there are wonderful people who are working at each of those different departments, but not necessarily working together. And each of those entities, each of them has their own administrative hearing process when it comes to issues relating to the parking occupancy. Do we need 3 different sets of administrative hearing processes? And by the way, they don't seem to succeed in bringing a bunch of money into the city. So it's about compliance, of course, but it's also about looking at the system. And if we had set out to create a complex system that doesn't work, we could probably not have done a better job than what we have right now when it comes to that parking occupancy tax. But it's fixable. That's the good news.
And what was so fascinating about this whole hearing before the Court Commission is all of those who feel like they have a stake in compliance with the parking occupancy tax. We heard from the industry themselves who are at a disadvantage when they're being honest in forwarding the taxes that they're collecting from their patrons versus competitors who are not. So they're very interested in assuring across-the-board compliance for kind of an equitable playing field. Neighborhood council budget advocates came to the commission hearing and talked about, again, the need to be effective in terms of collections, and they, of course, see the link between services to communities and the city's ability to collect, and also provided insight in terms of the way in which other cities do this. I mean, other cities combine these 3 administrative hearings into 1 administrative hearing, so that if you're found to be not in compliance with your payment responsibilities, that your permit could be revoked at the same time. So there's kind of, efficiencies in terms of and connections between the different enforcement mechanisms that the city has. And so again, these are issues that I think have broad-based support in the community to begin moving forward on effective and strong implementation.
If I may give one example that I think highlights the parking occupancy tax, but I think that just highlights other issues. And I don't know, I suspect all of us listened to the State of the Union speech in which the President said he was going to try to streamline some regulations, and he pointed out as an example that one department of the federal government regulates salmon in freshwater, and a totally different department regulates salmon in saltwater. And we have an example just like that with respect to the parking occupancy tax. And all these people are really good people. There's the police over here, there's the Department of Finance in here, and there's the city attorney's office over here. And we're suing lots of these people. It's in the courts. We may get some money. But at the same time, the people over here are issuing renewal permits to the same people that the city attorney is suing. Now that's like those salmon. And it's just one of those things, and I would say that if nothing else, the Inspector General would be charged with uncovering things like that and say, hey, how about before you issue a new permit to some guy, check to see if the city is suing them. I mean, it's just, the things are not rocket scientists. They're just, but somebody needs to have this as their full-time objective.
No question. Well, thank you for your update on this. We appreciate it and all your ongoing great work, and we will do our best to continue to shine light on this in this committee and move things forward.
Great, thank you
We
very
thank you so
much.
very much for your time and for all the effort that you and your whole office has put into this. And we look forward to this moving forward with speed.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Now, if we could have Department of Finance come up and comment on these same issues. So where do we stand on our progress on these various items?
We'll speak to that, Councilmember Koretz. To start off, my name's Ed Cabrera. I'm the Assistant Director for the Office of Finance. With me is our head of the Revenue Management Division, Mr. Jeffrey Whitmore, and his assistant, Todd Bowie, who will speak to some of the concerns that were voiced here. What I would like to state is the regrets of Ms. Antoinette Cristoval, our director. She wanted to attend today's meeting. Unfortunately, she's traveling to attend a funeral. So I do apologize for her absence, but she is aware and is vitally concerned about this issue, and we will speak to that. The Corps Commissioners raised several important points of issue. Obviously, we do agree that arriving at what is the true accounts receivable number is critical, so that we do have a solid number to work with and not a mythical figure. Number two, we do recognize and acknowledge that it will take coordinated and collaborative effort from not only Office of Finance but other city departments to address several of these issues. And we do appreciate the comments of Commissioner Farrar regarding finance's contributions and our efforts, and many of those efforts have been ongoing and initiated even prior to the formation of the core group. Having said that, I'll turn the mic over to Mr. Whitmore, and he can address some of the concerns that have been voiced today and answer any questions.
And I know some of these things actually have been started, as you said before, by Department of Finance. One of the questions ongoing is how do we obtain compliance? Because the Department of Finance is just one department, and other city departments have basically, in some cases, just said, well, hey, this isn't my priority. It's their priority. They're just one department. So at least, I don't know if they've said that, but that's what they've said by their inadequate response to some of these things over the years. So from your all point of view, how do we get better compliance with that? And cover all the other points that have already been discussed by our core folks.
Okay. Well, we certainly will address all of those items. I think compliance is one of the critical issues. There's no question about it. When we talk about finance and what it is that we do, I think we do everything we can within the scope of our authority to make it happen. In terms of the IG that continues to be brought up, we're in favor of anything that is going to help strengthen the ability to have departments comply and make sure that they collect on those liabilities that are due to the city as expeditiously as possible. So, we certainly acknowledge that, and we acknowledge the very hard work that the Core Commission has undertaken, and I've had the opportunity to work closely with many of those committee members, and I know that they are dedicated in trying to make that happen. So I certainly do want to acknowledge that.
Are there things that you can do to help move the IG concept forward?
That is I know that through the CLA's office there's been discussion, and we have provided input in that regard relative to the position. It is a policy decision, so I think that lies, that overall responsibility will lie elsewhere. But if that is something that is going to help, then we're certainly in favor. But just in terms of the report, I know that, as mentioned before, there is a report that we have been working on for some time, and I know that the commissioner mentioned that it came into, it was authored and released back in October. and we certainly have been trying to address those items as quickly as possible. One of the things that I just wanted to point out is that, of course, we have been implementing policies as directed. I think Council adopted Phase 1 of the Macias report, and we have been moving forward in that regard as quickly as possible. I think there are a number of issues also contained in the core recommendation that has been pointed out doesn't necessarily need additional approval for us to take action on, and we've been trying to address those as well. I do hear a lot about things that have not yet been done, but I certainly want to point out things that have been done relative to the core commission recommendations and others. In terms of the Offer and Compromise program, that was one of the new concepts and ideas that has been implemented, and we have staff dedicated to working with that to make it a successful program. We have a non-tax amnesty lien program that took effect on February 1st, and that will run through April the 30th. So we have revenue targets tied to all of these programs. They're all brand new. They've all been undertaken with the same existing staff that we have on hand, and we are making them work. We have a tax lien program that has taken effect. And I'm keeping my fingers crossed. We have a sizable check if things come through as promised that hopefully will arrive today. And then we have a secondary collection program that was mentioned as well that is also in effect. We've had approximately 12,000 accounts referred, valued at about $10 million. In the scheme of our account portfolio, it's not huge, but it's significant, and the program has now been undertaken. And that has required a lot of coordination between departments, with our automation team, and also with input from the city attorney as well. So there are a number of things that have been identified that we're making happen.
Are you seeing results from that one yet, or is it too soon to really know?
In terms of the secondary collection program?
Yeah.
It's too soon. I mean, we've actually asked for reports back from the collection agencies, but literally, it's brand new. And we know from past experiences with amnesty programs, most people wait until the last month of the program to take advantage. So, but as I said before, this has been, in terms of authoring this report, it's been a process. It's required us to work with the CAO, the CLA, and provide input, and also council staff as well, in trying to get not only a format, but content that everyone is comfortable with and agrees on. And I know that my director had actually hoped we would delay this until the next AGE meeting so that she could be here, and also that we will have at that point submitted the report. But it is in its final stage, and it should be released in the very near future. And when I say in the near future, within the next 3 or so weeks, I'm hoping.
So maybe we can have that for our first or second meeting in March and discuss that.
Certainly hoping so.
Right.
One of the things I wanted to mention as well is that one of our other undertakings is the implementation of centralized account receivable reporting. I am very pleased to have had Mr. Todd Bowie join us originally from the CAO's office, and he's been working very diligently with ITA and outside consultants to move that process along. One of the charges that we had in Phase 1 of Macias was enhanced accounts receivable reporting, and he's taken on that on his shoulders and been moving that along. So I would like to, at this point, have Todd address that.
Todd Bowie with Office of Finance. And as Jeff mentioned, we are progressing very well on target, on budget with regard to this implementation of a accounts receivable reporting system. Effectively, we've been through all the departments, we've reviewed all their systems, we've inventoried their databases, and we're bringing them together into a central data repository where we're going to be able to generate citywide non-tax accounts receivable data and reporting. We're looking at a December system implementation, December 2011, and shortly thereafter we'll begin to start generating reports from that system that will help further guide us down the path of the rest of the Macias study to enter into phase 2 and 3, which is where we're looking at getting into more of centralized collections management and issues like billing, consolidation, and issues like payment portals and customer identification. The logic of the phases is that right now the city does not have a good handle on its citywide accounts receivable data, that you need to be able to access and have robust data in order to better inform you how you're moving forward from a cost-benefit point of view, and also be able to leverage that to be able to inform us on the best ways to proceed in the future phases of the Macias study. So we are very much moving quickly as possible to get that in on time and, like I said, on budget. And I think we're going to have a nice, robust system for reporting once this is complete. And we're going to have a wealth of information that we haven't previously had access to. And so, please say it'll be before the Financial Management System Project Oversight Committee later this month, I think in about 2 weeks here. And so that'll be their opportunity to take a look at the project design and give us the go forward, hopefully.
And we presumably we expect to be able to bring in a considerable amount of money by adding these efficiencies.
The hope is that that by measuring and monitoring, that it will affect the behavior of the departments, and so in so doing, that there may be some benefits as a direct result of the project, but also being able to help us understand the universe that we're dealing with in terms of the accounts receivable data that's out there, and said help us to basically better move forward on the additional phases of billing and collections consolidations.
Very good. So, anything else that?
I didn't know if you had specific questions, but just 2 or 3 things I just wanted to point out, just in terms of progress as well, and a couple of things that have been mentioned by committee members. In addition to Todd's responsibilities, I know that we've already redesigned the accounts receivable template for reporting, which is one of the things that was mentioned, and I think that the commissioners will be extremely pleased when that is released and unveiled. So with the very limited resources that we have, I just need you to understand that unfortunately sometimes those need to be moved around to address what is most urgent at the time. But we continue to make progress on all 65 of these as quickly and as best we can. So I'm anticipating that in the very near future you're going to see some completion to these processes come forward, and I think you'll be pleased.
Now, I know we heard elsewhere that the EMS billing process has not gone as well in terms of monies in as we had hoped, and that left us at least for now about $8 million short. How closely have we monitored that? Do we know why it is that? And I think when we had this discussion, there was a discussion of filling an $8 million hole in the budget, of them totally catching up so that by the end of the year there would be no shortfall, and some number in between. So that tells me nobody really has a good handle on that. Where do you think we are in it? Are they following up their contract? Are there things we didn't expect? Why are we where we are, and where do we think we actually wind up by the end of the year?
Difficult to say. That was brought to my attention, a comment that was made apparently yesterday. So we are in the process of doing some very quick and expeditious analysis of that. My previous conversations with the department and figures that I had received was that with the initial referrals to collection agencies, it was working out well. So until I have an opportunity to delve into that a little bit more deeply, I feel uncomfortable answering that with any certainty. But I certainly want to find out what the problem is, or what the issue that exists is, because I certainly don't believe that should be the case.
Right, whatever you can do to provide some oversight on that. And certainly if it turns out that they wind up considerably far behind, I know there was a penalty clause. We want to be sure that that's enforced. But preferably, we want to be where we should be on this. I mean, part of why that whole project was contracted out was they were supposed to be able to do it better and faster, and it, thus far from what we've heard, it hasn't been the case. So I'd certainly ask a question on that. And also, year to date, we're apparently pretty far behind on parking fines, and not entirely clear why that would be. I know there was a question of whether DOT had hired their full complement of folks that write the tickets. We've heard both that they have and they haven't at various committees. There's also a possibility that factored in is that our meters weren't broken, and in fact they're new meters, but they're also easier to pay with a credit card, so maybe fewer people are violating. Do we have a sense of which of those or other things are factors, and why we're a certain number of millions of dollars behind this year on that?
I certainly think the department could respond more thoroughly than I, but just in conversation with them, I do know that revenues are down for a number of reasons, one of which is just because of the economic environment, and because people have less money, they're out and about less and violating less. But I think the department probably could respond more thoroughly than I.
Okay. Anything else that we should know from your perspective?
One of the topics that was mentioned today was the parking occupancy tax. And what I can speak to that is that the Office of Finance has been in the lead on this matter for several years. The particular industry is the cash basis industry. We recognize that there is a potential for some operators to act as scofflaws, so to speak, and it does provide an uneven playing field for those parking lot operators that are in compliance, that are adhering to the tax laws and so forth. We've had an ongoing collaborative relationship with both city attorney as well as CID. We've advocated and been successful in having certain provisions of the LA Municipal Code changed to ensure that there is the avenue to revoke certain operators' police permits, their parking police permits for delinquent taxes. That was a successful measure that was passed by the council and the mayor in the recent past. And we are referring cases over to CID to have lots closed, to have permits revoked. We also have a strike team that is identifying these delinquent operators at an earlier stage so that we can take action to ensure compliance. We also, through the litigation process and referrals from our collections unit to the city attorney, are going through several cases of litigation. So there's a multi-step effort that we are coordinating with CID, Police Commission, as well as with City Attorney to address parking lot operators that are not in compliance, and we have ongoing discussions at what the best practices are and what potential changes could be brought forth to the policymakers to address that particular issue. So again, just as the overall issue with the accounts receivable collections being a collaborative effort, this is also a collaborative effort, and we do realize the commissioner's statements that some things can move faster than others, but there are also considerations that aren't going to change overnight, and we have the mentality and the effort to continue the process and to work diligently to address those areas of concern, including the parking occupancy tax.
Now, I don't know whether we've looked at a few things like requiring all parking operators to have some provision for credit cards, because I think many of them don't, just because they would like to have fewer records and be less trackable. So certainly that would be one thing to think about. I don't know if we've looked at requiring them to pay those parking taxes or to forward them to us on a more frequent basis than we currently do, so that if we're being cheated, we can spot that more quickly.
Actually, the parking occupancy tax used to be a quarterly reporting tax. We took steps in prior years to change that reporting method to a monthly reporting. So we did expedite the reporting in the remittance process for that particular entity, and we're taking other steps and looking at other steps. For example, we've had discussions with city attorney as well as with CID to determine whether the city has the ability to enforce a provision for those repeated scofflaws, where if they are not in compliance, that certain mechanized barriers are put up to ensure that there is an auditable process in place so that parking taxes that are collected on the city's behalf are remitted. So there are a variety of steps that we're looking at and exploring, and again, within the constraints of the law and the parameters that the regulatory agency has, which is CID. I would point out that Office of Finance is not a regulatory agency. Office of Finance only has authority as a taxing agency. So we do not have the capability to regulate how a business conducts its activity. That's why there is a collaborative effort which is needed under the existing municipal code to ensure that the various parties that have a stake in it are working in concert to address these issues.
And I don't know how closely we've worked with the Board of Equalization, but our local board member, Jerome Horton, has repeatedly offered to me that they would be willing to do things to help enforce. So if there's some need to shut down a scofflaw and we don't have an easy process to do it, but they have better standing because of where they're positioned in the government food chain, they're willing and happy to be helpful to the city of Los Angeles. So I don't know if we've looked at ways that they can help and where they have more enforcement capabilities, but if we can and we haven't, we absolutely should do that.
Right. As a matter of fact, we work with a variety of other governmental entities. We work with the State Franchise Tax Board in terms of information sharing. We also work with the Board of Equalization with regards to both sales tax and business tax. Unfortunately, the Board of Equalization's authority extends more so to sales tax issues, but we certainly can look to any assistance that they can provide on various issues. So we will keep that in mind.
And keep in mind that while you may talk with other folks on staff there, if they're not as helpful as they could be, the board member himself wants to help on this and has made that commitment. So we shouldn't miss that opportunity.
Yes, actually, we participated within the last several months of 2010 in a meeting that was initiated by Board Member Horton, along with Councilmember Parks' office. So we have initiated a dialogue, and we will continue to explore any avenues of assistance that we can avail ourselves of.
And do we ever send someone out to do a random collection for a day at some of these lots that we have doubts about, just to see what kind of monies actually come in, to compare them to the rates at which we're actually remitted in terms of our parking taxes?
We have both internal audit staff that conduct audits of parking lot operators. We also have a contractor that performs field investigations. So the contractors are out in the field looking at these parking lots, counting cars, ensuring that what is being reported to us has some sense of reality to what's actually occurring out there in the various locations. So to answer your question, yes, we do have field presence out there through our contractor, and they have extensive experience in this particular area.
And I suspect a certain number of them will cheat on the natural, so are we actually catching people out there?
Well, when we go through our audit process, we are attempting to identify those taxpayers that have a tax liability that is not being properly remitted. So we do have successful results from our audit activity, as well as our enforcement activity with our field staff that do go out to ensure that taxpayers are complying with not only the business tax, but with also users' taxes.
Well, I thank you for all your information and for your status report as well on this. And I probably should do a follow-up question to DOT on the question we had earlier on why we're lagging behind in terms of parking fines and forfeitures.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for your help.
Good afternoon, council members, council member, your chairs. Amir Sadati, Interim General Manager, LA DOT. I'd like to first congratulate the Corps. They've done an excellent job. DOT has been in front of them many times. They've asked excellent questions, and I think in a complex situation such as the parking citations, I believe we've done a good job trying to walk them through the difficult to collect and the different buckets and how that is different than another debt. So I do want to commend them and thank them. We've had multiple meetings where we've expressed the challenges that occurs. We are still holding ACS to the highest standards possible. We're working and continuously to improve our current collectibles. So we're working on that, and to also answer one of the Commissioner Farrar's question, we have we're almost at the end of the line here with the request for proposal. We're hoping to release that by the end of February. We have worked with Office of Finance. We've asked the Office of the Controller as well, who's doing an audit on that, if there's any enhancements that could be made to what we're asking. So that should be up and running, I believe, in by the end of February. So the other, I think, question was asked by one of the commissioners about the old debt, and we have been actually at this in front of Budget and Finance, and I believe your committee and Corps, that the department went through the process of not, we came to a mutual agreement with the current vendor of the contract, ACS, so for them to provide years 3 and 4. Almost, I believe, over $90 million worth of uncollectible or hard-to-collect tickets after, I believe, 12 to 18 months of discussions with Office of Finance and their secondary collector, NCO. They finally, I believe, came to, again, Mr. Whitmore can probably talk more about it, but based on information, they did not come up and want to take that over. The department basically provided all of those citation information and data was provided to the Office of Finance, and I think what we asked is that there would be some sort of an infrastructure so that when information is collected, then our database is able to reflect that. So I know that there continues to be challenges, and again, I think everyone's doing its part, but every dollar that can be collected should be collected, and the department, again, will put a lot of the ideas, suggestions, many of which Commissioner Galpin mentioned, into the new RFP, again, to improve that in the new contract. Your final comment, council member, was regarding the citation revenue, which is on a downward trend. So again, it's a complex situation. Some of it has to do with a combination of many things. There isn't one thing you can point and say, you know, it's the pen that's not writing. Economy has a huge impact. Businesses closing down, people not having, people are driving less, people are parking less. Our parking costs have gone up. So that's one component. Obviously, we have provided better technology. We used to have a lot of the older meters that would, you know, fail, and public would have been subject to citations and confusion. So we've provided better opportunity with these credit card meters and the pay stations. So we have actually seen a better compliance in those areas. And the last but not least, you did mention the vacancies that we have in our traffic officer class, and that's approximately about 45 to 47 vacancies. And we actually, I know you have a motion that you introduced, and I think what we have provided the CAO and the mayor's budget team as a proposal would be a part-time traffic officer position. That doesn't mean that you know, that can't be worked in a way that there are going to be a mix of things, but I just didn't, you know, right now the department doesn't have the salaries in our budget to bring in 47 brand new bodies to the city. But we will work that through the different committees and different processes. I just wanted you to know that in general, part of the other reason the revenue citations is not what the budget had mentioned, is the implementation of the effective date. When the numbers in the budget was approved, that was based on a July 1 date. Unfortunately, the ordinance did not get published till 56 days later, and those that costed us approximately $2 million worth of revenue.
So even though your budget doesn't necessarily have the money for these positions, is there no one in the city that makes the connection to the fact that we're not staffed up appropriately to do the job, and in some ways, more importantly, because these positions pay more in revenue than they cost us, that this is costing the city money? I'm presuming you may be constrained by your budget, but have you asked the city for all these positions and said, hey, this is a revenue generating opportunity as well as an opportunity to staff up appropriately?
Yes, and thank you for bringing that up. We're just providing the policymakers such as yourself and the rest of the council with an option. Ultimately, the city council will decide what that option is. We're just providing a different method of enhancing our workforce by creating additional jobs, even though it's part-time. You know, traffic citations occur in peaks, and right now, as mentioned, with the compliance up and others, you know, the escalating cost. If you look at a graph, we have our escalating salaries and the citation issuance, so that the curves are getting larger. So we wanted to make sure that the city elected officials and policymakers have the information before you for you to make that decision, whether you like to go with all 100% full-time staff or part-time or a combination. So we're asking, we're provided some additional information to the CAO, and we've put that in actually in our budget proposal. And I believe it's one of your items also, I believe, before Transportation Committee, or has been referred to both Budget and Finance and Transportation Committee.
So are you, in the current proposal, are you proposing 45 half-time people, or are you proposing the part-time equivalent of 45 full-time people?
Yeah, because of the part-time situation, Councilmember, they work about 1,000 hours, and they would, you know, and as I mentioned, there's peak periods where there's a lot of potential violations. So the part-timers would be solely for parking enforcement. They would not be doing traffic control, so it would be less time training. They will be solely related to just parking enforcement activities. So right now, our proposal has a 2-to-1. So I think we're asking for as many as 80 possible to bring in, so that we can put them in the weekend shifts where we don't have as many officers. We now, as you know, have many areas of the city have night times. The meters go till 8 p.m., they go till midnight. So there's other activities that we don't have that. And also it helps our full-time traffic officers to then concentrate back on some of the ancillary duties that they were doing, you know, more of the scufflaws and the Tiger Team activities, and being at the key intersections, helping traffic control with the gridlock situation. So a couple of years ago, you know, we were directed to basically, stop all the ancillary duties and concentrate on more of the parking enforcement. So this, again, we're just providing those proposals with information for the elected officials to make that call.
Well, to the extent that we can encourage this, I would encourage us to hire these new people and to have them do the parking enforcement, and to have the other people that were doing parking enforcement continue doing parking enforcement. Because the fact is, we need that enforcement and we need the revenue. So I'd hate to see us cut back on something that would help us fill the revenue gap and at the same time give us the enforcement at the appropriate level. So at least that's one person's thinking, and a direction I'd encourage you in.
Thank you.
Thank you. Also, we requested a few other report backs a while back. I don't know how many months ago this was, but we asked the CAO and CLA to report back on the necessary steps for the council to create an inspector general for collections and come up with a timeline. I don't know if there's anyone in the room here to speak to that. But if not, it would appear not. If we could give direction to the CAO and CLA to be prepared to report back at our first meeting in March on that subject. We also, let's see. There's also a report back requested on amendments to the citywide billing and collections guidelines. ITA was to report back on technology needs regarding the core recommendations. I don't know if there's anyone here from ITA to speak to that, but if not, we would ask that they report back to our committee at the first meeting in March. There's also a request to have the city attorney report on what legal issues they have to address or overcome regarding the core recommendations, and if we could make the request again to the city attorney to give us that report back as well at the first meeting in March. Also, if we could ask EMS to the fire department to give us an updated report in March on where we stand on the EMS billing process and what any holdups are in achieving greater success in that arena. And actually, one more question for DOT, which you may be able to answer now, on what the status is of the new RFQ for citation collections.
Yeah, as I mentioned, the RFP is one RFP. It's not an RFQ that would do citation processing and collections. And it will
both combined.
Yeah, it will be one. So we've taken the Macias recommendations. We've talked to the Office of Finance. We've asked for any comments from the Office of Controller, who's doing a current audit on the ACS. And we've also, this go around, we will have it in a way that it will have tasks, so that if there is in-house opportunities to do certain things in-house, then it will be broken out. That again, the council will see what the costs and benefits are in that fashion. So it's all in one large document, and that's why it's taken a little bit longer. It's very comprehensive, very complicated.
And when do you think we actually have this together and put it out?
End of February is the goal. We're 95% done. It's just all the, making sure the city attorney and everything else has the final blessing before we put that out.
Great. Thank you. Well, thank you, everyone, for your presentations and your updates. And I think we will continue to, I know, we will continue to ask for updates on a more frequent basis so we can try to do more to drive this forward. And lastly, we have one public comment from Julie Butcher with SEIU 721. Which item is that?
Thank you. Just a couple of points. If there is an RFP ready to go, on ticket collection, it really needs to be reviewed. This was subject of what should have been a task force that was appointed by the former chair of the Transportation Committee back when the mayor was the chair of that committee. The workers of the city have been attempting to engage in this process. Frankly, we wouldn't be surprised if ACS wrote the report, wrote the RFP. That is the intimate relationship, sadly, between this consultant and this department. There is outstanding $41 million that they still owe the city, both in equipment and in revenue. If a parking lot owner operator is collecting the tax and not remitting it to the city, that's theft. Representing city workers in this most difficult time, we really appreciate the work of this commission, and it's a volunteer commission. And while thanks to city workers is really a cool thing, figuring out how we provide service and maintain jobs is really much more important. That nothing has happened on any one of these 65 recommendations is shocking. It's time to move. It's time to act like it's a crisis. It's time for the city to act like it's all one city, to collect every possible cent. Part-time traffic officers are not the answer. The fact is that traffic officers, for every 25, cost $2.25 million fully loaded, generate $5.5 million on an average day. And that's whether or not people are driving in mass, or whether they're parking, or whether there's gridlock or not. The fact is that there is a number of parking tickets that is optimum. We are nowhere near that, and that is based on the number of workers. Part-time traffic officers, the union is opposed to that. We have said that to the department. Instead, we believe that there are jobs that are in danger of being lost. They could be immediately moved to perform this essential service. Thank you.
I'll let you finish up if you have anything.
No, that's actually, it's probably better that I not. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you particularly to the Corps Commission for its good work as very effective and expert volunteers thus far. And thank you to Department of Finance and other city departments for the progress that you've made so far, but we've got a long way to go. And let's move to item number 5.
Item number 5 is continued from the meeting of August 10th, 2010. This is a city controller report relative to the audit of and semi-annual follow-up to the blueprint for a comprehensive citywide anti-gang strategy.
Hi, Cynthia Varela with the Controller's Office. At the August 10th AGE meeting, we presented the results of our semi-annual follow-up of the blueprint for a comprehensive citywide anti-gang strategy. At the meeting, the GRID office indicated that the first-year evaluation of the anti-gang program had recently been received. And AGE requested the controller to report back with an analysis of the mayor's office action plan to address the outstanding recommendations from the original report, as well as a review of the latest program evaluation report. We received the action plan from the GRID office on August 30th, 2010. Based on the plan as presented, the actions taken or planned by the GRID office, as well as the targeted implementation timelines, are acceptable to the Controller's Office. With regard to the Year 1 Program Evaluation Report that was prepared by the Urban Institute, we reviewed the report and compared it to the evaluation contract between the Grid Office and the Urban Institute. We were looking at the contract's description of services that were to be provided by UI and therefore expected by the city. During our review, the Grid management indicated that UI's scope of work had been revised due to operational challenges with program implementation. Our assessment, though, is based on the formal contracted scope of work for UI. There were 3 primary services to be provided by UI. The first was to conduct separate evaluations for each of the 12 grid zones and to pool the results to obtain a comprehensive grid assessment. Our assessment concluded that this was not completed. We noted that UI completed 12 zone profiles in addition to the Year 1 report. The zone profiles provide useful baseline and process information, including the successes and challenges to program implementation. However, neither the zone profiles nor the overall Year 1 report concludes on the overall effectiveness of the grid program or the revised anti-gang strategy. This was also acknowledged in UI's report, where they stated that the evaluation was significantly handicapped during the first year with respect to the outcome component. As you know, the program evaluations are expected to demonstrate outcome results, and that's something that council members and the public expect. This is to demonstrate how well a program has met its objectives. And what we found is that the zone profiles in the Year 1 report fell short of this expectation in the contract. The second contract deliverable was to collect data and perform analysis on the implementation process to assess progress towards benchmarks and fidelity to program design. This included looking at community perception of gang-related issues, pre- and post-analyses of individuals to determine the effect of prevention and intervention programs, a cost-benefit analysis to assess the cost of implementing the strategy in relation to potential reductions in gang crime and other outcomes. Our assessment concluded that this was partially completed by the contractor. As mentioned, the zone profiles in the Year 1 report describe the provider's program implementation successes and challenges, and the Year 1 report also provides pilot results from a reassessment of a small sample of grid program youth. However, the Urban Institute acknowledged that the pilot retest is not an outcome assessment. And also, UI indicated that there were delays in obtaining gang and crime data at the grid zone level from the police department. So as a result, UI could not perform a cost-benefit analysis. The third contracted deliverable was to create reports, including quarterly progress reports, to explain the statistical models and analytical methods used for monthly data collected from grid zones, a process and outcome briefing, and summary interim refinding report, and a final evaluation report. Our assessment concluded that this was not completed. As noted for the first 2 contract deliverables, reports were technically submitted by UI, but they did not complete those first 2 services. So the first year report does not contain all the information that was contractually expected. In summary, this is a complex social service program, and we recognize that it's common to experience challenges in evaluating this type of program. UI's quarterly progress reports made it evident that the full outcome evaluation would not be conducted. Grid did not formally amend or renegotiate the contract nor communicate these challenges or revised expectations to policymakers and the public. And in the end, the city did not get the program evaluation that was defined by the contract and expected, although the contract was just about paid. It was for a 15-month period, over $868,000 had been paid to UI. Because there was no formal contract modification or renegotiation, we cannot determine the reasonableness of the value of the services provided and paid for. As far as Year 2 planned activities, based on UI's Year 1 report, the Grid Office has made progress to address issues that hampered the program evaluation in the first year. Grid has also contracted for an in-house evaluator who will help oversee the program evaluation. And so we're encouraged by these actions. It's still imperative that Grid ensures the evaluation progresses in a timely manner and includes programmatic outcomes. If there are any setbacks, Grid should act quickly to postpone, cancel, or revise the contract with UI. In our review, we also had some additional observations that we included in our report to the committee. We noted that UI did not submit reports detailing the tasks and activities completed each month with its invoice. Because they're paid on a cost reimbursement basis, which in accordance with an agreed upon budget, this is an acceptable payment method, but it also requires diligent oversight to make sure that the invoices are adequately supported. We also noted that some of the payments made to UI were made with grant funds and noted some potential issues. The grant awards were made for a program evaluation, but as we've stated, a comprehensive program evaluation was not completed. The grants were for evaluations of specific grid zones, but the full amount invoiced by UI for a month or months of work was paid. We think it's unlikely that UI spent the entire period on evaluation work that related to a specific grid zone. The city's contract with UI also specified payment schedules, including the grant funds to be used. But as I've discussed, the grants were for activities that related only to specific grid zones. So these could be question costs. That could be the result. What we heard from grid management is that the grantors were informed of the activities that were being performed, and there was no indication of noncompliance with the funds. We believe that Grid Office should seek specific approval and clarification from the grantors that the payments to UI are allowable cost. And that concludes our report back.
Well, this is somewhat confusing, but not your report, but how this is all transpired. I mean, it really seems like we got to be not too gentle, a half-assed response to what we were supposed to get, and it seems like on a reimbursable basis, we're reimbursing them for things that we didn't get.
Well, and Grid Office can probably speak to this better, but during the work that was being done by UI, there was an agreement between, what we were told, an agreement between grid management and UI because of the challenges that were being noted with program implementation. Some of the providers had implemented the program in different ways. There wasn't a consistent approach to doing that, which would make it difficult to do an across-the-board evaluation. Because of these setbacks that had occurred, it was a decision that the scope of work that was going to be completed by UI was changed. What happened was this wasn't documented in a formal contract, either a contract amendment, renegotiating what they were going to pay for the services, or anything like this. It was something that was done more on an informal basis.
Does the city generally do things on an informal basis without any ability to document what we're getting and what we're paying for?
I can't say if they generally. Is it a good practice? I would say no, it's not a good practice to do. You know, from the audit perspective, we want to make sure that everything is well documented so that both sides know what to be expected and that you have a basis for that payment. And so that's what we were looking for.
I mean, did you not say earlier that essentially this is so murky that you can't even evaluate whether we got our money's worth or not?
I think in our original our second follow-up report, the report that was issued in July, I think we did talk about the evaluation work that was being performed and how there was a change in the scope of work. I think we did bring to question about how much was being paid and that there should be a better understanding of what was to be done. The comments that I'm making today really resulted from the time that we presented that status of that follow-up report. Grid at that time said that they had just recently received an evaluation report. We hadn't seen the final report. We had only seen progress reports up to that point that talked about some of the work that UI had done. So we hadn't seen the full report. Your committee asked that we look at the report and then see if we thought that met the criteria of an program evaluation.
Yeah, and you clearly still feel that it did not.
Correct. But as far as the value of the services, I mean, we do say in our report there is a value to those services that were provided. It's what that value is, I can't determine because it wasn't, renegotiated or discussed in an informal situation to decide what should be paid.
And my understanding is we're continuing the contract with this same entity
I believe so, yes.
when we can't evaluate what the value is of their services.
Well, this was during the first year of evaluation. We're now in the second year that Grid would be following their program. So this would be what we saw from the report that UI said is that things were being set up so that a program evaluation could occur. I mean, we want to make sure that Grid really makes sure that and follows that closely to make sure that a program evaluation can be done at the end of the second year.
Yeah, well, I'd certainly hope so at a minimum. I guess we should hear from folks from the mayor's office and Grid on the details of this, and hopefully whether or not we've clarified this to the point that we have any idea whether we're getting the services that we're paying for.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm Guillermo Cespedes. I'm the Deputy Mayor, both Director of the Office of Gang Reduction and Youth Development. And I'm here with Dr. Deborah Hurst, who's our current, Denise Hurst, current Director of Research, and Gerardo Avila, who handles our grants. Let me start by saying this. We do take the Controller's report very seriously, not just from a fiscal oversight point of view, but also from a programmatic point of view. We take that report as an opportunity to improve what we do. We do recognize that there were, despite the fact that this is the gang program in the country that is most visible, most touted as the most effective comprehensive strategy, the one that the rest of the state follows the lead, we do fully recognize that there was not a formal filing of a change in the scope of work. So I would like to run through with you what took place, and I think that may make some more sense.
That would be appreciated.
Okay. The Urban Institute was contracted to do two things. One is to conduct a process evaluation, which means to look at how things get implemented both by providers and by the Grid office, and to provide an outcome evaluation which would produce data that would tell us the level of effectiveness of the program. In April 2009, shortly after the contract started, there was a contract modification on the scope of work because it was determined that the Grid office and the evaluation needed to bring in a team of experts, national gang experts, to serve as part of the evaluation advisory committee. That includes Malcolm Klein, Cheryl Maxim, and the best gang researchers in the country. At that time, Jeff Carr, currently the chief of staff, was the person in my position. So that was the first change in the scope of work, which you can see in the narrative reports, but there is no formal filing and augmenting of the scope of work. Simultaneously, the second scope of work was, the first scope of work rather was that, the idea that a program of this size in a one-year period with a population of very gang-involved neighborhoods, some former gang members, some at high risk for joining gangs. The issue of engaging that community in an academic, rigorous evaluation was pretty lengthy because these communities are not very trusting of researchers and academics. So it was decided informally that the first year it was unreasonable to expect outcomes, that it would be a process, primarily process-driven evaluation. Again, that was not documented. You can see it in the narrative reports, but there was not a formal filing that the Grid office and the Urban Institute were moving in that direction. The program that has now become probably the most nationally visible program for the grid office is the Summer Night Lights program, which touted a 57% reduction in homicides this past summer and a 40% reduction in gang-related violence, was not a part of the original contract with the Urban Institute. At the time that a contract was written, was designed with the Urban Institute, none of us had really the idea that the program would become so central to the mayor's comprehensive strategy. Therefore, it was determined that the Urban Institute needed to shift part of its scope of work to include the Summer Night Lights program. So that was yet another change in the scope of work that was done informally. Now, at that time, we had a different person overseeing the evaluation, but it is still my responsibility, even though I didn't take over the office until September of 2010. Another change in the scope of work was around the work of gang intervention workers, meaning how do you evaluate the effectiveness of gang intervention workers, primarily former gang members. We had just put in a process for training them, so that was scope of work, change in the scope of work 3. So there were 2 more. So in short, rather than going through each detail, there were 5 changes in the scope of work that were driven by the feedback loop of implementing, gathering information, and continuing the implementation. This was not a waste. This was a way of driving the evaluation forward and matching that with implementation. As a side note, a program of this size undergoing a process and outcome evaluation, for the most part, is very lengthy. I am not a trained researcher, but we've spent a lot of time discussing this with trained researchers, and outcome evaluations during the first year are extremely difficult and somewhat rare, and our research director can speak to that. The work that was provided by the Urban Institute at the end of the first year does not match the formal contract. It matches the scope of work that was designed as a process, the process that I described. So the value of it to the grid office has been extremely valuable, and as we talk about what we've accomplished since then, I think that may become a little bit more obvious when you hear a little bit about the things that have been in place. So as a way of clearing up the context, this is primarily an issue that the grid office acknowledges that we did not formally document those changes of scope of work, but there in fact the scope of work was changed out of necessity to be able to move the evaluation forward and the program implementation forward.
Is this a typical thing in the city of Los Angeles or in the mayor's office to make changes informally, not go back to policymakers, not document the changes?
No, sir, it is not.
Is there a reason for it?
Well, there are multiple reasons for it. I think that there was, I'm not sure any that would be acceptable to this committee. I think it was an issue of the tension between implementation and evaluation with a community that is crisis prone, that is not amenable to evaluation, that requires recalibrating and changing directions and responding to what goes on the ground, and also oversight of the evaluation by not a trained researcher. So one of the immediate changes that was suggested in the controller's report was that the grid office bring in a trained researcher to make sure that those tensions that are related to practice on the ground don't derail the evaluation process, for lack of a better word.
Is there a reason why that wasn't obvious in the first place, that doing this kind of research would require someone with
I think in part, sir, the at the beginning of the evaluation and the implementation, and again, I spent time as a member of a statewide task force tracking program development, implementation. A program of this size, I don't believe nationally has ever been evaluated. This is, LA is fairly ahead of the curve as it relates to both gang prevention and gang intervention. So the grid office, in essence, was traveling on new ground, new territory. So it's a typical, I think that the office that we have and the approaches that we have implemented, most of them are pretty innovative because of the nature of gangs in LA, the history of gangs in LA, the fact that we are the largest. So all these things are, I'm not presenting them as acceptable excuses, but what did take place is that we acknowledged we did not formally change the contract scope of work. That is what's created some of this difficulty. Now, since then, the evaluation process has progressed forward in the way that we expected. Based on the changes that have been made, we retooled the contract, made those changes in the contract. We brought in a researcher. They can help us drive the evaluation along with the Evaluation Advisory Committee. And we've implemented a new fiscal policy to monitor contracts differently. In other words, we put a corrective action in place that we can talk about in more detail, but as a way of explaining what took place, that is the issue. The issue is that the grid office recognizes that formal change in the scope of work was not done, so it made it very difficult to evaluate from an outside perspective the reasonableness of the contract. Now, was the information valuable that was provided by UI? Was it useful in moving into year 2? Yes. Is it helping the program? Yes. Is the evaluation further along than we have stopped? We believe so.
Is it worth around the $900,000 that we paid for it? Did we get out of it what we intended to get out of it? And does this help us evaluate the broader program as we look at almost $400 million in shortfall, looking at things to cut? Does this
From the perspective
good
of
enough to be helpful to us?
From the perspective of the grid office, yes, sir. That evaluation was helpful to us, and I believe our research director can speak a little bit more about that. But yes, I believe that it's helped the grid office, it's helped the city of Los Angeles, and I think that the outcome data that we're getting now confirms that.
I mean, we can look at the outcome, but you can't necessarily, without adequate analysis, make the assumption that the outcome and the program are connected. I mean, there are other issues like that. You can say, well, we had a drop in crime, we have 10,000 police officers, therefore it happened because we have 10,000 police officers. But we know there are multiple other factors, and in that one, if you didn't say that we cut overtime and we actually had the impact of cutting several hundred police officers and we still had a drop in crime, you could come to another conclusion. So the question is, yes, we had a drop in relevant crime. How do we know that this program played a significant role, and was the analysis helpful enough for us to get a feel for that?
That's an excellent question, and one that I pose in my research methods class often. So you get an A in research methods if you didn't get an A before. But that is really the critical question, and that is also a reason to support Urban Institute as the contractor for the evaluation, because they are nationally known as a very prestigious research institution, and what comes with that is the skills, the sophisticated skills, to start looking at those very questions. So upon coming in, we worked on a revision of the scope of work, and one of the revised tasks in that was an interim report that would be very specific to outcomes. And so what they have done, and I have, it's very draft, we are in the process of providing feedback to Urban Institute so that we can move this to a final draft, which we believe will be available in the upcoming weeks. But in that draft, for example, not only do they examine crime in the grid zones and SNL parks areas, but they have comparison groups. So the answer to your question is, in order to best determine if the results or outcomes that you measure are related to program, it is to have comparison sites in which the program was not given. And so that's what they were able to do, and that's not an easy task with a very large, substantial amount of data provided by the LAPD. So, for instance, in the SNL areas, just to give you an example, they were able to identify the reporting districts that surround the SNL parks, as well as the reporting districts that have no relationship to the SNL parks. And so they analyzed the data for gang crime around SNL parks and those RDs collectively that were not around SNL parks, with the idea being that if we saw any sort of different outcome for the SNL RDs, and we would compare that to the non-SNL RDs. In doing that, directly after, and we have data for the 2008 SNLs and 2009 SNLs, they had a delay from LAPD in getting the SNL data for 2010. We'll have that in the upcoming weeks too. But to give you an example, there's 2 years of consistent data. In 2008, the drop in, should I wait? This is, my numbers are so important. You know, I am a researcher, I stop for the numbers. In 2008, the drop in gang crime directly after the SNL programs were implemented was 36.5% in gang crime. In the comparison areas, the drop was 18%. So it was double around the SNL parks. In 2009, the drop in gang crime was 31%, directly following the implementation of the SNL parks. The comparison sites, the drop was only 4%. So in 2008, the drop was double that of the comparison sites where no SNL programs were held. And in 2009, the drop was 10 times as great as that in the comparison sites. Now, one might say, well, that just might be a fluke or something like this. I mean, it's hard to say it's a fluke when you start to see 2 years, but nonetheless, what if we expand it out to the grid areas more generally? And we have data from them on those as well. And the same pattern holds. The gang crime dropped much steeper in the grid zones than in the comparison zones, which leads us to believe, agreed, there are many different things that could be contributing to that, but the assumption would be that those other things would be similar in the treatment group, where SNL is and where grid zones are, as well as the comparison group. The only thing that's different is the implementation of the grid activities, be them SNL or prevention. So this is pretty amazing results, to be very honest with you.
I think also the rate, and maybe you want to talk about the rate of it dropping faster.
Well, that's the steepness. So, like I was saying, so it's double. The steepness in the drop is twice as large in the SNL parks compared to the non-SNL parks in 2008. But that line, that steepness of the line, is 10 times as great in the SNL parks compared to the non-SNL parks in 2009. It's just, it's eye-popping, to be honest with you. And there's very similar results for the grid office. I'm not sure how far you want me to go with numbers, but for the grid zones, the drop was 17%, and compared to about 12% for the non-grid. So we still see a similar drop. It is steeper for the SNL parks, but is still consistent with the notion that these areas are receiving extra services through the grid office.
Now, let me ask you a couple more questions about the program itself. It obviously ran into roadblocks based on the population that was being surveyed. If this is a knowledgeable and professional entity, how did they not anticipate any of these roadblocks if they had a knowledge of the communities and how to survey them?
Well, I can start with that, and I think you'll have to fill in some of the blanks. One of the very exciting and ambitious parts of the grid idea and concept was to move this work, and this is different from anywhere across the nation, is that there was not only a recognition that prevention services should be directed at those highest risk for gang membership. Everyone agrees in the literature, if you read it. Everyone says, yep, we should target the right kids, get those ones that are really high risk. The problem has always been, how do you identify those high risk? So what GRID did was it brought in researchers who were very good at knowing the literature and developing a tool. And that tool was implemented for all prevention providers. I'm not sure that anyone, including myself, because I had been part of the community needs assessments, part of the GRID office, and then I did not have any sort of involvement for a long time, but I was kept apprised of what was going on. Everyone, including prevention providers, said, we need something like this. That's great, because now we can't get dinged for not serving the right population. Well, when you actually go to administer a screening tool, there just are issues. But I don't think anyone anticipated how large the issues would be in terms of really putting a delay in getting all the surveys completed. With that being said, the one thing that I would like to stress as a researcher is that I have done, I'd say that my area of expertise is program development and evaluation. I go in, I help people build programs, and I help them design an evaluation. In none of those experiences have we had an outcome evaluation in year one. Every single experience, the first year is a building year. It just is the nature of these things. We all know there will be barriers and obstacles, but we don't know where they'll be. We try to get outcomes, we all have them, but without exception, I have not seen outcomes produced in year one. What is very important, and I think should be lauded I understand the other issues, but what is, I think, wonderful is that GRID committed to evaluation from day one. And so instead of trying to work out the barriers and then bring an evaluator in, they brought the evaluator in order to document the process and learn from the process, so that now we have incredible outcomes in year two. And usually it takes 3 or 4 years to actually get substantive outcomes. But not only do we have crime data, but in addition to the crime data, we have data on that screening tool pre-post. Amazing results. There's been a drop in every risk factor that they're tested on, statistically significant drops, incredible percentage drops, 20, 30% decreases in delinquent behavior in the use of alcohol. These are all consistent findings pointing to the same thing, which is pretty amazing. And I truly, aside from my sitting here as the research director for GRID, I have to tell you that is really amazing to produce that amount of substance in year two. We would expect outcomes in year two, but to have that much substance. In addition, we have provider surveys, LAPD surveys, parent focus groups, and youth interviews this year.
Now, would it be a typical situation and run into trouble because you had someone who wasn't an experienced researcher in a key position in this program? How did that happen, and would that be a typical situation?
Oh, yes. In fact, I wrote a note when you had asked Guillermo about that. It is my recollection when we did the community needs assessments, which were at the very beginning of the GRID office, when we handed them over and there was a plan set out, there was a position for a research director. And I remember coming back to talk to the program managers, and I think it was Mildred that I had spoken to. I said, how's it going with the research director position? And she said, well, it's really hard to fill. And the reason it's hard to fill is because you really need someone in that position that is at the PhD level. And the reason you need that is because the people that we're working with at UI are in PhD positions. And I know this will be a terrible surprise to you, but there is a bit of a hierarchy in our academic world. And so someone who doesn't have a PhD, I'm not saying I agree with it, would have sometimes a problem convincing UI that, you know, they might go in a different direction. So there really needs to be somewhat of an equal footing. The problem is that a lot of PhDs that do research go into universities. And so it's really hard to hire someone in that position full time. So I think they just struggled with that, and getting off the ground, there were so many things going on that it was difficult. And in fact,
so what was the background of the person that actually took the job?
I don't think I think I'm the first one to serve in the research director position.
We didn't have a research director, sir. We had someone to oversee the evaluation. He was a master's level person, but not a trained researcher.
And that was because
Well, we
was
was
he unable to find someone at
we were
any price?
we were
for that?
desperately, well, at any price. I think that we have to be mindful of, budget restrictions, but it wasn't so much at any price. It constituted two things: one, finding a competent researcher, and the other, finding a competent researcher who could actually work with these communities. Again, I don't want to belabor that point, but we are dealing with not your average neighborhoods. These are neighborhoods racked by high levels of violence. Even the reductions that Denise talked about, these are taking place in neighborhoods that have 400 times the level of crime, gang-related crime, than other neighborhoods. So those reductions are even more significant when you're discussing that. So it's been a process of finding the right person to be able to do a job that, frankly, it is not being done anywhere else in the country. So again, I come back to, we're traveling on new territory. And
Knowing you need someone experienced doesn't seem like new territory, and it doesn't seem like a coincidence that once you realized that it wasn't working well without a trained person, magically you were able to obtain one.
well, I think that that's the feedback loop that I referred to, that we take these reports seriously, and, we respond to those reports.
And I think it should be noted, I love this work, and I'm very grateful of the opportunity to participate in the grid work, because it truly is groundbreaking, and everyone in the nation has its eyes on the work. But I'm still a professor at Cal State LA as a full-time job. My contract is buying my time out at the university, and as much as I love this position, I'm not sure I would trade my university position for the full-time. Does that make sense? So I think going back to this notion of having a position and not being able to find it or fill it, I think there are challenges around that, and I think this has worked out really nicely to contract for my time to come and help.
Yeah, it just, I don't know, it seems like a bizarre process. It doesn't seem like there's a justification for not having formalized the changes to the scope of this contract. I can understand that you had some difficulties, but at the same time, if every project and every department behaved this way, the whole city would be in chaos. And we're in some level of chaos anyway because of our economy, but not this level. I haven't heard you yet explain the sequence that would have led to not having a formal contract, not going back to policymakers for any kind of an approval or an update. How did this happen?
It was a process of making changes that link implementation and evaluation at the same time, noting them in the narratives and in the discussions, but not having someone administratively taking that and transferring it to a formal change in the scope of work. It was I'm not sure how else to keep coming back to it. It was an oversight of the person overseeing that contract, which was, again, ultimately my responsibility.
And I know there are a lot of things that we've said we typically couldn't deliver, that an evaluation in the first year is almost impossible. But was that not part of the contract?
That's why the contract was changed, sir, informally. In other words, once the RFP was put out, UI won the contract to do evaluation. The very first meeting with Jeff Carr, the evaluators, and the Evaluation Advisory Committee, taking a look at the lay of the land, they decided at that point that outcomes would not be achievable in that first year. That decision was made jointly between the Evaluation Advisory Committee, the Urban Institute, and back then the head of the office. The person in charge of making those changes formally on paper did not do so.
Well, I guess one of the things I'm trying to figure out is why did we have deliverables in the contract that one wouldn't have expected to be feasible? If we didn't expect them, why was that in the contract? How did we wind up with a contract that had to be altered so quickly?
Basically, I'm not sure that I can answer that question. I think that at that time it was viewed that the lay of the land would be more compatible with the evaluation. Then again, this is what LA has on the ground. It's not what other cities have on the ground as it relates to gangs, as it relates to the culture of gangs, and all of that. So evaluations by their very nature have to have a feedback loop. And that feedback loop is you start out in a particular direction and you make assessments as to whether that direction is feasible. It was decided that it was not feasible administratively at a pure, and I hate to use the word bureaucratic because it implies something negative. I don't mean it that way. That change was not documented, and it was not documented by the person overseeing the contract, but this is not to pass blame. It was just an administrative, bureaucratic oversight. They got caught in the middle of the intensity of the work.
But your expert just told us that in the first year, you never get a good evaluation. So then why was that in the contract to begin with?
You don't get an outcome evaluation.
Right, an outcome evaluation. But is that not what we were paying for?
Well, and again, I was part of, but also marginal to this entire process. So I'm going to offer something, and please correct me if I'm wrong, Guillermo. Because of the commitment of the GRID office to evaluation, it's my understanding that several gang researchers from across the country who are very well known for their work and very esteemed, and they have every right to be esteemed, were brought together to help prepare an RFP so that the evaluation would be as closely aligned to what it should be. And so those researchers were convened, but those researchers, and this is the underbelly of researchers, is they had opportunity to sit around a table and craft the best evaluation possible. Assuming, and remember, this is done just as the GRID office is getting off the ground, assuming that everything would be fully implemented and ready to go. So when the RFP went out, that was really what had been designed, was the assumption that everything would be fully in place. And that, I think, comes from researchers sometimes living in their own research world of ideal situations. So Urban Institute responded to that RFP. And Guillermo can talk more about the review process, but I believe, again, there was a commitment to people who understood research, and they were part of reviewing that process. So I think the real heart of your question is, how did it originally start with a scope of work that was maybe not possible in year one? And I think that the reason is because with good intentions, researchers had driven some of that train, and the program just wasn't at the place that those researchers were thinking it was, nor should it have been, because they were just starting. So there was no wrongdoing there. Does that help? I mean, because that is what happened. I mean, I know the folks that were brought in, and they're great, but they also don't necessarily know the communities, but they know the literature and they know what good gang research is.
I mean, it's a quirky situation for me, and it's a difficult question, which maybe I would pose to the controller's office. We have a set of deliverables that we paid for. We didn't get what we paid for. Should we be asking for some of our money back? Do we look at that, or do we say, well, the mayor's office and the GRID had some sort of an informal deal? It's never been put in writing, so we'll never exactly know what it is, and nobody can really evaluate whether we got our what we paid for and what we were looking for, what we thought we paid for, or not?
Excuse me, Fair, it's Safari, the controller. As an auditor, we can look at, in terms of compliance with the contract, whether the services paid or provided matches the rates stated in any written contract that they have. In the absence of that, it would be a legal question, basically, whether we receive the services and we paid for the dollar amount. Is it reasonable in light of services that we received?
I mean, just on the face of it, you'd have to say no. But on the other hand, presumably they acted in some level of good faith because they were told they could change the scope, even though we weren't told. They were told. So where does that leave us? What does your office recommend that we do? Other than
in terms
clean up the process and go forward, look back and ask for a refund of some of our money? I mean, what would be
we are not asking, again, asking for a refund would be a legal question in terms of whether city is entitled for any reimbursement or not. In terms of moving forward, we had a recommendation that they have an expert in-house staff as part of the evaluation. In fact, we made that recommendation back in 2008 when the controller issued the blueprint, that one of the recommendations was that you need to have good oversight and an in-house evaluator to make sure that program is succeeding as planned. They have done that. They brought in an expert at this time, and the way we understand moving forward to year 2, they would be able to conduct the evaluation.
And so are you satisfied that the problems that led to this confusion and incomplete product, certainly in terms of what we originally contracted out for, that we've corrected these problems and they'll be able to function in a clearer and more transparent way, and that we'll get our money's worth?
Yeah, again, one of our recommendation is if they run into a situation that their scope would be different from what they anticipate, they ought to bring back to the policymaker amendment, new contract, new scope, discuss it to make sure it's in line with the level of effort they expect in the future from the contractor. And our understanding is they agree with that, and if that's the situation, we accept that.
Well, I certainly want to see that as an absolute bare minimum. It certainly makes me look personally askance at the valuation project, and at a time when we're looking to cut the guts out of city government and almost everything we're doing. It certainly doesn't help me look more favorably at the overall project either. So we certainly would encourage that this be done with considerably better oversight in the future, and something we'll be looking very carefully at as we come towards budget time.
Do you want to talk a little bit about the oversight component?
I was just going to say that. It may be helpful to know that we've taken the controller's recommendations very seriously, and from the moment that I came on, we began revising the scope of work with UI Harder. And so we have a much more aligned scope of work to expectations that are consistent with an outcome evaluation and a more comprehensive look at what GRID's activities are. To that end, we require, as part of those tasks, UI must submit a detailed summary of all their work on each task each month by the 15th of the month to me. I then review that, and we have each month a call where we go through all of the tasks and identify and address any issues that have come up in the work. As a result of that process, the interim report that will be finished very soon is night and day compared to year 1 report. It is very clear, it is very specific to data and outcomes, and I think it addresses in a much more specific way the concerns that everyone would have with the controller's report, both in terms of aligning the scope of work to the actual work being done, as well as the actual substance and utility of the results that you're getting back from them.
And when is this report expected to be accessible?
Right now, it's sitting with me. I need to give feedback, I would say within 3 or 4 weeks, if not sooner.
So around early to mid-March.
Yes, absolutely, by then.
Wonder if we could ask the Controller's Office to come back in April and give us an evaluation of this report. I don't know if either of you just heard what I asked, but I wonder if we could ask the Controller's Office to come back in April with an evaluation of this report once it's made available to you in March.
We'll do that.
That would be appreciated. Well, thank you for your candor and the information on all of this. Certainly not overly enthused about the process that was used up to this point, but I'm glad to hear that it appears that most of this, if not all of it, has been corrected or will be corrected in the future. I mean, it's an important program, and certainly we wouldn't want it to be jeopardized by lack of ability to evaluate its success. So
Thank you, sir.
thank you for being here. Yes, we'll hold this in committee and hear back in April. Let's see, next, let's have item number 2. And
Item number 2 was continued from the meeting of August 17th, 2010. This is a city controller report relative to a review of the Los Angeles Department of Transportation's contract with Integrated Systems Research Corporation to provide an automated vehicle locator system.
I mean, this audit was initially in committee in August of last year, at which time we asked the department for a report back in 30 days on implementation of the audit's recommendations. It's been around 5 months. My understanding is that the Controller's Office has been given such a report without enough time for them to respond with any kind of an assessment. My understanding is our office has not gotten any kind of report back to us, which I'm concerned about. It would appear the department has not shown much willingness to respond to the policymakers with the city on the council, which certainly leads to significant concern. So I'll give you a couple minutes to summarize what your report is, and then I'll ask you for some questions to come back with in 30 days, along with a full report to us.
Certainly. Robert Andalone on behalf of the Department of Transportation. First of all, I'd like to thank the Controller's Office for providing us the opportunity to comment on the oversight and monitoring of this particular contract. Just a couple of significant findings. They had asked us to look at the necessity for the system and whether the city would have been better off buying the system for $1 at the end of the contract term, rather than continuing to pay the maintenance and airtime costs on a year-by-year basis. In the report, we provided some details as to why the situation was the way it was. Specifically, at the time that the contract was set to expire, we had come before the Transportation Committee requesting permission to go out to request for proposal. There was a desire to review whether that request for proposal could be expanded to include other city departments. So we requested a 1-year extension. And at the end of each extension, we also found other situations where we were not able to have the RFP out and or the funding secured. We've identified different avenues that we sought to try to remedy that situation. But basically, we went back to the contractor and asked them if we were to have purchased the system for $1 at the end of the contract term, what would have been the maintenance costs associated with it. Contractor indicated that if it was a month-to-month or 1-year extension, it would have been at the same lease price that we were paying. So we would have been paying the same amount of money. there would have been a cost savings if the city had opted for a 3 or 4 year contract extension. That was not probably reasonable or prudent at the time to go ahead and request that kind of extension, given that we were really requesting a request for a proposal to look at new technology and or cost savings from competition. So that was the one primary finding within the report. The second finding was discussing the matter with the city attorney's office to determine exactly what would be the city's position relative to invoking, quote, the warranty, to determine whether the department's decision to purchase new modems to replace old technology would have resulted in the city being able to secure a credit from the contractor. The city attorney reviewed the contract as well as the vendor's response, and based upon the information that he saw, he found that we would have a very unsuccessful legal claim if we would try to pursue it. Part of it was a short-term contract there was 1 year left in the contract when we did this. There was a continued need for the service. Neither party anticipated a change in technology. We would have had to have gone before a contract amendment, before council, if we wanted to do that. So again, it came down to the decision that we would not be able to pursue a legal claim, go back and try to collect money from the contractor for that expenditure. We did try several times. We had long-distance phone calls with the contractor who resides and is stationed in Israel as far as this particular service is concerned. We did try to use the belief that there was good faith extended on both sides, that it would warrant their concessions on this. Their only concession was going forward, they would agree to expend either $200,000 to $300,000 of software development costs to have a new and improved system. However, it would be contingent upon either an 18-month or a 36-month contract extension, which again is outside of our authority to approve.
Well, I'd like to ask that you report back in 30 days with a report to this committee, and to have it include a few questions additionally. One would be, how was it that we purchased this system and never fully implemented it, or even significantly partially implemented it? Who winds up in charge of the oversight for this? Where does the mayor's office come in terms of accountability for such expenditures, which obviously were fouled up over a very extensive period of time without ever being implemented? Why does it take a controller's audit to tell the council and the public that we have 178 of these units in storage and never being used? Was DOT aware of it? And were they ever going to reveal that information to the council and to the public? One of the reasons the controller audited this particular contract was because of a complaint to a whistleblower hotline. You know, who knew about this but kept it hidden so that a whistleblower needed to reveal the information? And are we aware of other contract abuses like this in the department that are well hidden? And how do we hold DOT responsible for these kinds of foul-ups? You don't need to answer these now, because we'd like to have a report responsive to the committee and have that included and added to it.
Certainly.
So I'd ask you to come back middle of March to our second meeting with all of that information.
Okay.
Councilmember Koretz, our second meeting in March falls on a council recess. We only have one meeting in March at this time, which would be March 1st. March 15th meeting falls on a council recess.
Well, we'll work that out. It may be we call a special meeting or make it the first meeting in April.
Yeah, and Councilmember Koretz, I'm wondering if also this committee is willing to maybe have a joint committee with transportation, because at the same time that you're reviewing this, we probably have to bring back some recommendations, not only to the questions you asked, but ultimately if the city council is willing to give the 18-month extension or not. So I'm not sure if you want to think of that right now or get to us later, but I'm just, this contract is about to expire if it hasn't expired, so we need some sort of a policy decision down the line.
Let's see if we can sort that out between now and then.
Okay, thank you.
And then lastly, item number 3.
For the record, this item is continued.
Why is this item continued?
This item is continued until the meeting in March.
Oh, do I have the? Why would item 3 be continued?
No, item number 2.
Oh, yes, I'm sorry. Yes, this item will be continued to our meeting in March.
All right, thank you.
You had me confused with that. Item number 3.
Item number 3 is a city controller report relative to follow-up correspondence to the follow-up audit of concessions contracts at the Department of Recreation and Parks.
And my understanding is that Rec and Parks has implemented the controller's recommendations and that the controllers accepted their actions. So probably my primary question is with recommendation number 18 about what the issues were surrounding the driving range at Rancho Park Golf Course.
For clarification, Siri Kalsa from the Controller's Office. We did note in our last correspondence that Rec and Park has taken action in addressing the recommendations, but I do want to be clear that most of them, 14 out of the original 20, are in progress and ongoing.
So they haven't completed those?
Right.
Okay, yes.
Rob Morales, Recreation and Parks. Good evening, Councilman.
Hello.
The issue at Rancho Park Golf Course with the driving range is the concessionaire is contractually obligated to perform certain capital improvements at approximately a valuation of $2.3 million. To date, nothing has been done. We have, one of the problems was building the fence there, they needed a zoning variance. They didn't obtain the zoning variance and actually withdrew their request back in 2006. At which time the department went through the process and we've obtained the zoning variance and we've requested the concessionaire to begin construction. The concessionaire, through dialogue with their lawyers and our city attorney, has still refused to comply. So we are in discussion with the city attorney right now about a response and what our legal recourse is.
So the concessionaire is continuing to operate, but just refusing to make the capital improvements?
Yes.
Were there neighborhood issues? I vaguely recall something about the height of the fence, how high that could be constructed.
Right. The height of the fence was the issue back in 2006, but as I said, when they submitted their zoning variance, they didn't go through the entire process, so they were never denied. They just withdrew it once there was some public, the public came out and actually said they didn't want some of the fence height. But we've gone through the process and we've obtained the zoning variance. The height of the fence is going to be the existing height. I'm not sure if it's 80 feet. I'd have to take a look at my records. But we're not going to get any higher, so there wasn't any public opposition when we went through the zoning variance.
So right now it's just a repair?
It's repair and replacement.
Okay. And so, other than that, the other issues that are in process, any difficulties or controversies, or are they moving forward?
For Rancho Park?
And for the rest of the the audit and the recommendations?
Well, for the rest of the audit, it's ongoing. A lot of it is contract monitoring, a lot of it is taking a look on a case-by-case basis every time these contracts come up for rebid. What is the best process to do it with? You know, I want to thank the Controller's Office. They've been a great partner in this concession program in assisting in identifying issues and the ability to focus on priorities, and especially being able to have that audit to train staff as the staff comes in, and also as the ability, we have long-term concessionaires out at the areas to where when they ask, well, why are you suddenly asking me for this item or that item, I can always point to the audit and say, because the Controller's Office says so. So it's a great tool, and we've been making great progress in updating our outdated contracts, issuing RFPs, and executing agreements, and monitoring the contracts. To give an example, we do have an inspection program where our staff goes out there and reviews contracts and contract items, obligations, and we have a secret shopper program, and we have internal auditors who make surprise visits and formal audits. So a lot of these are ongoing. We did submit our response to a couple of the items that council had previously requested, which is one with the business model aspect. I've spoken to the County of Los Angeles and the County of Ventura, and they had a similar situation of difficulty or challenge in developing a universal business model for other concessions, or universal attempt to have protocols or guidelines.
How different were theirs ultimately than what we do currently?
Well, when we say different, they not too different. They don't have, example, our golf program is different than their golf program. They lease out the entire facility, including their restaurants and driving ranges, as opposed to we operate our golf facilities, but we lease out our driving ranges and our restaurant facilities. So little differences like that. But there is, lost my train of thought, sorry. But I think one of the discussions I had with Ventura was, I like the statement that they said there, we're trying to muddle through this economy with our businesses, just like every other city is. What we're doing in order to address this issue with the business model is we have retained the services of a consultant to determine the best business practice for municipal golf overall, which includes concessions. We are in the process of selecting a consultant to determine the best business practice for our Greek Theater, which is our largest concession, and in this economy, it is very difficult to maximize profits when there's such competition and little money out there to be spent on concerts. And we will identify a consultant to review, take a look at our non-golf contracts, our concessions, and make a determination on the best business practice on those also. So we are moving forward with the business model aspect of it.
How's the Greek Theater doing compared to previous years?
Compared to previous years, it has been declined from 2000 to a height of 2007. They've been making steady less revenue. And part of that is, one, the economy. Part of that is the Nokia, which has very close and similar events, and the ability to draw newer acts. But there's also a lot of competition in the area, from the Hollywood Bowl, the Staples Center. So they have seen a reduction in their revenue.
Are we having trouble attracting big-name acts to the Greek Theater currently? Because, I mean, just as an observation, I haven't noticed or heard about as many in the last year or two, it seems.
I want to say trouble. We have the competition with the Hollywood Bowl and with Nokia, and a lot of the acts tend to want to go towards the Nokia, since it's new and it's indoors. So it's not affected by weather conditions or other conditions as an outdoor venue would.
So are we looking presumably for someone that can do a better job of marketing the Greek Theater and increasing their draw?
Well, that's one of the reasons I wanted to get a consultant on board that had a lot of knowledge about the concert industry, is to let us know, is this the case from now on? Is this the situation that 2007 was an anomaly as opposed to an expectation to be reached again? Because there is a lot of competition out there, but also the Nokia is seeing a decline also. They're heavy in debt. They might have maxed out, and we may have the opportunity to get an upper hand there. But I wanted to bring in the consultant to be able to give us more of an expertise in that direct business.
Great. Well, thank you both very much. We'll keep an eye on this, but we will, for now, note and file this report.
Thank you.
And no other public speakers. I don't believe we have any other agenda items that we have not covered. And so we are adjourned.